Good evening. Tonight, I want to take you somewhere extraordinary. Somewhere that existed 2,000 years ago on the shores of ancient Egypt. A place where the greatest minds of the ancient world gathered under one roof. Where every scroll, every thought, every discovery humanity had ever made was collected and preserved. I'm talking about the Library of Alexandria. And tonight, we're going to uncover what really happened to it. Now, you've probably heard the story before: a great fire, thousands of scrolls burning, centuries of knowledge lost in a single night. It's a dramatic image, isn't it? The kind of story that stays with you. But here's the thing: that story, the one most people believe, isn't quite true. The real story is far more complex, far more fascinating, and in some ways, far more tragic than any single fire could ever be. Imagine for a moment standing in ancient Alexandria. The Mediterranean breeze carries the scent of salt and papyrus. You're walking through marble corridors lined with wooden shelves, and on those shelves rest hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Philosophy from Athens, mathematics from Syracuse, poetry from every corner of the known world, medicine, astronomy, history, drama. Everything humanity knew, everything we had learned, everything we had dreamed, it was all here, in this one building, in this one city. And then imagine watching it slowly disappear, not in a blaze of glory, but gradually, quietly, over centuries. That's the real story of the Library of Alexandria. And tonight, I'm going to share it with you. We'll travel back to the beginning, to Alexander the Great and his impossible dream. We'll meet the scholars who lived among these scrolls, brilliant minds who calculated the size of the Earth, who proposed that our planet orbits the Sun, who performed the first human dissections in the name of science. We'll examine the fires, yes, but also the politics, the religious upheaval, the slow decay of funding and care that truly brought this wonder to its knees. By the end of our journey tonight, you'll understand something most people never discover. The Library of Alexandria didn't die in one dramatic moment. Its death was slower, quieter, and in many ways more preventable. And perhaps that's the most important lesson it has to teach us. So settle in, get comfortable, let your breathing slow, and let me take you back 2,000 years to a city built on dreams, to a library built on ambition, and to a mystery that still haunts us to this day. Let me tell you about a young man with an impossible dream. His name was Alexander, and by the age of 30, he had conquered more territory than any human being in history. His empire stretched from Greece to Egypt to the borders of India. He was brilliant, ambitious, and utterly convinced that he was destined for greatness. And in 331 BCE, standing on the northern coast of Egypt, Alexander pointed to a small fishing village and declared that here, right here, he would build the greatest city the world had ever seen. The location was strategic genius: a natural harbor protected by the island of Pharos, the fertile Nile Delta nearby to provide food, trade routes connecting the Mediterranean to the wealth of Egypt and beyond. Alexander saw what others couldn't. He saw a city that would bridge the Greek world and the Egyptian world, a city that would become the center of commerce, culture, and knowledge for centuries to come. He personally walked the site, marking where the main streets would run, where the temples would stand, where the markets would bustle with traders from every corner of the known world. According to ancient sources, when his architects ran out of chalk to mark the ground, Alexander ordered them to use barley flour instead. Birds descended and ate the flour, which some took as a bad omen. But Alexander's seer interpreted it differently. He said the city would prosper and provide nourishment to people from many nations. Whether this story is true or legend, it captures something essential about Alexander's vision. He wasn't just building a city, he was building a dream. But here's the tragedy that makes this story so poignant. Alexander would never see his dream completed. Just 8 years after founding the city that bore his name, Alexander fell ill in Babylon. He was only 32 years old. Some say it was fever, others whisper about poison. Whatever the cause, the man who had conquered the known world was dead, and his empire began to fracture almost immediately. His generals, the men who had fought beside him for years, turned on each other. Wars erupted, alliances shifted. The vast empire Alexander had built was carved into pieces like a feast divided among hungry wolves. But one general, a man named Ptolemy, was clever enough to secure the greatest prize of all. He claimed Egypt. And with Egypt came Alexandria, the city Alexander had founded but never finished. Ptolemy was different from the other generals. While they fought over territories and armies, Ptolemy understood something profound. Military power fades, borders shift, empires crumble, but knowledge, true knowledge that endures, it survives beyond any single lifetime, any single dynasty, any single civilization. And so Ptolemy set his mind to a goal even more ambitious than Alexander's conquest. He would gather all the knowledge in the world, every scroll, every book, every thought humanity had ever committed to writing, and he would house it all in one magnificent building, in the city Alexander had dreamed of, in Alexandria. What happened next would change the course of human history. Ptolemy didn't just build a library, he built something unprecedented, something the ancient world had never seen, a center of learning that would attract the greatest minds of every generation, a place where knowledge wasn't just stored, but created, expanded, debated, and shared. And that, my friend, is where our story truly begins. Ptolemy the First, who took the title Soter, meaning the savior, was not your typical ancient ruler. While other kings measured their power in soldiers and gold, Ptolemy measured his in scrolls. His obsession with collecting knowledge bordered on the fanatical, and frankly, I find it one of the most fascinating character traits of any leader in ancient history. Here was a man who had fought in Alexander's army, who had witnessed brutal battles and political betrayals, and yet his greatest passion was building the world's most comprehensive library. He called it the Mausion, which means Temple of the Muses. The Muses, in Greek mythology, were the divine patrons of the arts and sciences. So from its very inception, the Library of Alexandria was conceived as something sacred. Not a religious temple in the traditional sense, but a temple to human creativity, human curiosity, and human achievement. The building itself was part of a larger royal complex connected to Ptolemy's palace, signaling that intellectual pursuit was as important to him as political power. Now, here's what most people don't realize about Ptolemy's vision. He wasn't just creating a storage facility for old books, he was creating what we might today call a research university. Scholars from across the Mediterranean were invited to Alexandria and offered something remarkable for the ancient world. They received free housing within the Mausion complex, they received meals provided by the royal household, they received salaries funded directly from Ptolemy's treasury. Their only obligation was to think, to study, to research, to expand the boundaries of human knowledge. Imagine being told that your job, your actual job, was simply to learn and discover. That was life inside the Mausion. The scholars who came represented every field of knowledge the ancient world recognized. Mathematicians worked alongside poets, astronomers debated with philosophers, physicians studied beside historians. This wasn't specialization the way we know it today, where experts speak only to others in their narrow field. This was intellectual cross-pollination on a scale never before attempted. Ideas flowed freely between disciplines. A geometric proof might inspire a new theory of music. A historical text might shed light on medical practices. The boundaries between subjects were fluid and constantly shifting. Ptolemy also understood something about knowledge that many modern institutions forget. Books and scrolls mean nothing if no one can find what they contain, so he didn't just collect randomly. He organized, he cataloged, he created systems to track what the library held and where to find it. This might seem obvious to us today, but in the ancient world, it was revolutionary. Most collections of that era were simply piles of scrolls, accessible only to those who happened to know their contents. Ptolemy wanted his library to be searchable, usable, and accessible to every scholar in residence, and the collection grew rapidly. Ptolemy spared no expense in acquiring scrolls. He sent agents throughout the Mediterranean to purchase private collections. He funded copying expeditions to preserve rare texts. He even developed some rather creative methods to ensure that Alexandria possessed the definitive version of every important work in existence. Some of these methods, I should warn you, were not exactly ethical by today's standards, but perhaps that's what made Ptolemy such a successful collector. He wanted knowledge more than he wanted approval, and in the pursuit of that knowledge, he was willing to bend a few rules. Let me share something with you that reveals just how serious Ptolemy and his successors were about building their collection. Every ship that entered the harbor of Alexandria was subject to search, not for weapons, not for contraband, for books. Royal officials would board incoming vessels and confiscate any scrolls they found on board. The original scrolls were then taken directly to the library, where scribes would create copies. And here's the remarkable part. The owners didn't get their originals back. They received the copies. The originals stayed in Alexandria, stamped with a notation indicating they had come from the ships. This practice continued for generations under Ptolemy's descendants. The library's collection was labeled according to how scrolls were acquired. Some were marked as purchased, others as donated, and a significant portion bore that special designation, showing they had been, let's say, liberated from travelers passing through the port. The Ptolemaic kings were creating what would become the world's greatest repository of knowledge, and they weren't particularly concerned about playing fair. But here's an even more audacious story that shows just how far they would go. Athens possessed something priceless: the official state copies of the great Greek tragedies. These were the original manuscripts of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, preserved and protected as cultural treasures. Ptolemy III, grandson of the original Ptolemy, desperately wanted these texts for Alexandria. He proposed a deal. Athens would loan the manuscripts to Alexandria for copying, and Ptolemy would provide an enormous financial deposit as security: 15 talents of silver, an astronomical sum that demonstrated his good faith. Athens agreed. The manuscripts traveled to Alexandria. The scribes created beautiful, meticulous copies. And then Ptolemy made his choice. He sent the copies back to Athens. He kept the originals. He forfeited his 15 talents of silver, considering it a fair price for possessing the authentic manuscripts of the greatest playwrights in history. Athens was furious, of course, but what could they do? The scrolls were in Alexandria now, and Ptolemy had technically fulfilled the letter of his agreement, if not its spirit. This ruthlessness extended to private collectors as well. Throughout the Mediterranean, families who possessed valuable manuscripts found themselves approached by agents of the Ptolemaic court. Some were offered generous purchase prices, others were subjected to more persuasive tactics. The message was clear: Alexandria was building something unprecedented, and it would acquire the necessary materials by whatever means proved effective. Now, you might wonder how historians view these methods today. The truth is complicated. On one hand, the aggressive acquisition practices seem troubling by any ethical standard. On the other hand, many texts survived specifically because copies existed in Alexandria. Works that might have been lost to fire, flood, or simple neglect in their original locations were preserved because the Ptolemies had brought them together in one protected repository. The collection grew to staggering proportions. Ancient sources provide various estimates, and while we can't verify the exact numbers, most scholars believe the library eventually held somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls. To put that in perspective, no other institution in the ancient world came even close. The Library of Alexandria wasn't just the largest collection of its time, it was in a category entirely by itself. And within those walls, something remarkable was happening. Brilliant minds were gathering, and they were about to change everything. Picture yourself walking through the corridors of the Maussion on an ordinary morning. Sunlight streams through high windows, illuminating the dust motes floating above endless rows of papyrus scrolls. The air carries the distinctive scent of old paper and fresh ink. Scholars in simple robes move quietly between the stacks, some carrying armfuls of scrolls, others lost in thought as they wander toward their private workspaces. This was the daily reality for hundreds of the ancient world's most brilliant minds. They lived here, quite literally. The Maussion complex included dormitories, dining halls, gardens for contemplation, and covered walkways where scholars could discuss ideas while strolling in the shade. Everything was provided. Food appeared at regular meals in the common dining room, where conversations ranged from the nature of the gods to the mathematical properties of triangles to the best way to preserve fish. Salaries were generous enough that scholars could focus entirely on their work without worrying about basic necessities. But here's what I find most fascinating about this arrangement. There were no fixed curricula, no assigned topics, no bureaucratic oversight demanding progress reports or measurable outcomes. The Ptolemaic kings trusted that if you gathered brilliant people, gave them access to all recorded knowledge, and freed them from material concerns, good things would happen. And they were absolutely right. The scholars came from everywhere: Greek mathematicians from Athens and Syracuse, Egyptian priests who could read the ancient hieroglyphics, Jewish scribes who translated Hebrew texts into Greek, Persian astronomers, Indian philosophers. The diversity was intentional. Different cultures approached problems differently. They brought different assumptions, different methods, different frameworks for understanding the world. When these perspectives collided in the corridors and dining halls of the Maussion, sparks flew. Collaboration happened naturally. A mathematician struggling with a geometric proof might consult a philosopher about logical methods. A historian researching ancient Egypt might work with translators who could access primary sources in their original languages. An astronomer developing new theories about celestial movements might borrow computational techniques from an accountant tracking trade revenues. The boundaries between disciplines were permeable, and knowledge flowed freely across them. Arguments were common, sometimes heated. The ancient sources describe vigorous debates echoing through the gardens, scholars gesturing emphatically as they defended their theories against criticism. This wasn't seen as disruptive, it was the point. Truth emerged from rigorous questioning, from testing ideas against objections, from forcing thinkers to defend and refine their positions. The Maussion wasn't a place for quiet acceptance of received wisdom. It was an arena for intellectual combat, conducted with words and logic rather than swords and shields. And yet, for all this energy, there was also space for solitary contemplation. The gardens offered quiet corners where a scholar could sit alone with a difficult text, working through its meanings slowly and carefully. The stacks of the library itself were vast enough that one could always find a quiet alcove, surrounded by more knowledge than any single lifetime could absorb. This community of scholars, supported by royal patronage and surrounded by the collected wisdom of ages, produced breakthroughs that would echo through millennia. They didn't just preserve the past, they created the future. And over the next few sections, I want to introduce you to some of these remarkable individuals whose work still shapes our world today. Let me introduce you to a man named Euclid. He walked these halls around 300 BCE, and his work would remain the foundation of mathematical education for over 2,000 years. That's not an exaggeration. Students in Europe and America were still learning geometry from textbooks based on Euclid's Elements well into the 20th century. Some still do today. What made Euclid remarkable wasn't that he discovered new mathematical truths, though he certainly contributed original ideas. His genius lay in organization and proof. He took the scattered geometric knowledge of his time, theorems, and constructions that had accumulated over centuries from Egyptian surveyors and Greek philosophers, and he organized them into a single coherent system. Starting from a small set of basics assumptions, he built proof upon proof, each theorem supporting those that followed, until he had constructed an edifice of mathematical knowledge that seemed almost unassailable. The Elements consisted of 13 books covering plane geometry, number theory, and solid geometry. It demonstrated how complex truths could be derived from simple beginnings through careful, logical reasoning. This approach, starting with clear definitions and axioms, then proceeding step by step to proven conclusions, became the model for rigorous thinking in every field. Scientists, philosophers, and even theologians would cite Euclid's method as the standard for how arguments should be constructed. Now, let me tell you about Eratosthenes, who served as the chief librarian of Alexandria around 240 BCE. Eratosthenes was what the Greeks called a pentathlete of the mind, accomplished in multiple fields without being the absolute master of any single one. Some of his contemporaries called him Beta, the second letter of the Greek alphabet, suggesting he was always second best. But I think history has proven those critics wrong, because Eratosthenes accomplished something that still astonishes me every time I think about it. He calculated the circumference of the Earth, and he did it with remarkable accuracy, using nothing more than careful observation, basic geometry, and brilliant reasoning. Here's how it worked. Eratosthenes knew that in the Egyptian city of Syene, modern-day Aswan, there was a deep well. At noon on the summer solstice, sunlight reached the very bottom of this well without casting any shadow. That meant the sun was directly overhead, but in Alexandria, at that same moment, a vertical pole cast a measurable shadow. Eratosthenes realized what this meant. If the earth were flat, the sun would be directly overhead everywhere at the same time. The shadow in Alexandria proved the earth was curved. By measuring the angle of that shadow and knowing the distance between the two cities, he could calculate the full circumference. His result was approximately 250,000 stadia. Converting ancient measurements is tricky, but most scholars believe his answer was within 2% of the actual value, 2%. Using sticks and shadows and pure mathematical reasoning, more than 2,000 years before satellites and computers, a librarian in Alexandria figured out the size of our planet. These weren't isolated geniuses working in vacuum. They were part of a community, building on each other's work, challenging each other's assumptions, pushing human understanding forward step by step. And Euclid and Eratosthenes were just the beginning. The Library of Alexandria attracted minds that would reshape our understanding of medicine, astronomy, poetry, and the very nature of reality itself. Now, let me tell you about an idea so revolutionary that the world wasn't ready for it. Nearly 2,000 years before Copernicus proposed that the Earth orbits the Sun, a scholar working in Alexandria had already figured it out. His name was Aristarchus of Samos, and around 270 BCE, he proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system. The Sun, he argued, sits at the center. The Earth and other planets revolve around it. The apparent motion of the Sun across our sky is an illusion created by Earth's own rotation. It's remarkable to think about. The same insight that would later get Galileo in trouble with the Church, the same framework that would revolutionize our understanding of the cosmos, was proposed right here in Alexandria, and then, for reasons historians still debate, it was set aside. The geocentric model, with Earth at the center, remained dominant until the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries. Why didn't Aristarchus's theory catch on? Several factors played a role. The physics of the time couldn't explain why. If Earth was moving, we didn't feel that motion. There were also religious and philosophical objections. But perhaps, most importantly, the geocentric model worked well enough for practical purposes like navigation and calendar making. Sometimes good enough is the enemy of true. But here's what fascinates me. The idea existed, it was written down, it was preserved in the library. Somewhere in those scrolls, the truth about our place in the cosmos waited for someone to take it seriously. That's what libraries do. They hold ideas in trust, waiting for the right moment, the right reader, the right cultural conditions to bring them back to life. Let me also introduce you to Herophilos, a physician who pushed the boundaries of medical knowledge in ways his predecessors never dared. Around 300 BCE, Herophilos conducted the first systematic dissections of human cadavers in recorded history. Before him, medical knowledge about the body's internal structure came primarily from treating wounds or examining animals. Herophilos looked inside human bodies and actually documented what he found. He distinguished between arteries and veins, noting their different properties. He studied the brain and recognized it as the center of the nervous system, contradicting earlier theories that placed intelligence in the heart. He examined the eye, the liver, the digestive system. His careful observations laid groundwork that would inform medical practice for centuries. Was this work controversial? Absolutely. Some ancient sources claim Herophilos dissected condemned criminals while they were still alive, a practice called vivisection. Modern historians debate whether these accounts are accurate or exaggerated by rivals. Either way, Herophilos represents something important about Alexandria. It was a place where intellectual curiosity could push past traditional boundaries, where the drive to understand trumped squeamishness and convention. I should also mention Callimachus, who created something that might seem less glamorous than measuring the earth or mapping the human body. He created the Pinaches, the first systematic library catalog. This massive work organized the library's holdings by subject and author, allowing scholars to find what they needed. Without Callimachus's organizational system, the library's vast collection would have been nearly unusable. Sometimes the most important innovations aren't discoveries at all. They're systems that make discovery possible. These minds transformed Alexandria into something more than a storage facility. They made it a factory of knowledge, constantly producing new understanding. At its peak, the Library of Alexandria held something almost unimaginable. Ancient sources give us various estimates, and scholars today debate the exact figures, but most agree the collection numbered somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls. Let me help you understand what that actually means, because numbers this large can lose their impact. A single scroll typically contained about the same amount of text as one book of Homer's Iliad. The complete Iliad and Odyssey together filled about 48 scrolls. So when we talk about 500,000 scrolls, we're talking about the equivalent of tens of thousands of modern books. Every major work of Greek literature, every philosophical treatise, every scientific observation, every historical account, every medical manual, every mathematical proof, all gathered in one place. The collection covered every subject the ancient world recognized. Philosophy from Plato and Aristotle, but also from countless lesser known thinkers whose works have since been lost. Poetry from every region and era, epic and lyric and dramatic. Scientific works on astronomy, geography, botany, zoology. Medical texts on anatomy, surgery, pharmacology. Mathematical treatises on geometry, arithmetic, music theory. Historical accounts of wars, kings, cities, and peoples, religious texts from multiple traditions, legal documents and political speeches, letters and memoirs of famous figures. And here's what breaks my heart when I think about the library's eventual decline. We know the titles of many works that once existed but are now lost. We have fragments quoted in other texts. We have references in catalogs and commentaries. We know these works existed. We just don't have them anymore. Consider the Greek tragedies. We possess complete plays from only three playwrights: Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. But Alexandria's collection included works from dozens of tragedians, most now completely lost. Sophocles alone wrote over 100 plays. We have seven out of more than 100. The rest existed in Alexandria, were read and studied and performed, and then somewhere along the line, they vanished. The same pattern repeats across every field. We have fragments of the philosopher Epicurus, enough to reconstruct his basic ideas, but his complete works filled hundreds of scrolls. We know Archimedes wrote treatises that haven't survived. We have references to of historical accounts of civilizations that are now entirely mysterious to us. The ancient world produced an enormous body of knowledge, and the Library of Alexandria collected most of it, but so much was lost. Now, here's something to consider as you rest tonight. Every idea that has reached us from the ancient world is a survivor. It persisted through centuries of war, religious upheaval, political collapse, and simple neglect. The texts we have are not necessarily the best or most important. They're the ones that happen to be copied enough times, preserved in enough places, that at least one copy made it through to the age of printing. What we lost might have been equally valuable, perhaps more so. The Library of Alexandria represented humanity's first systematic attempt to preserve everything we had learned. Its failure, and it did ultimately fail, raises questions that still haunt us today. How do we protect knowledge? How do we ensure that what we've learned survives? What are we losing right now that future generations will desperately wish we had preserved? Those questions become more urgent as we turn to what happened next. Because the library's decline began with fire. The year was 48 BCE. Julius Caesar, the most powerful man in Rome, had pursued his rival Pompey across the Mediterranean and into Egypt. Pompey was dead, murdered by Egyptians hoping to curry favor with the victor, but Caesar didn't leave. He became entangled in a power struggle between the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII and his sister, a woman named Cleopatra. You've probably heard of her. Caesar backed Cleopatra, and suddenly he found himself trapped in Alexandria with a small force, surrounded by an Egyptian army loyal to her brother. The situation was desperate. Enemy forces controlled the city. Egyptian ships in the harbor threatened to cut off any chance of escape or reinforcement. Caesar made a fateful decision. He ordered his men to burn the Egyptian fleet. The fires spread. Flames leaped from ship to ship, turning the harbor into an inferno. And then, according to several ancient sources, the fire jumped to the shore. Buildings near the waterfront caught and burned. And among those buildings, at least according to some accounts, were warehouses containing scrolls. Here's where we need to be careful, because the historical record becomes murky. Some ancient sources claim the library itself burned that night. Others say only warehouses containing scrolls meant for export were destroyed. Still others don't mention the library at all when describing the fire. Modern historians have debated this question for centuries without reaching a definitive answer. What seems most likely is something in between the dramatic destruction of the entire library and nothing happening at all. The main library complex was probably not in the immediate harbor area, but Alexandria was a major exporter of books, and warehouses near the docks almost certainly contained scrolls ready for shipment to other cities. These warehouses likely burned. Some portion of the collection was probably lost. But consider this. Writers who lived in the decades after Caesar's fire, including Strabo, who actually visited Alexandria, described the Mausion and its scholarly community as still functioning. If the entire library had been destroyed in 48 BCE, these writers would certainly have mentioned it. They don't. The library continued to operate, scholars continued to work. The collection, though possibly diminished, survived. So, why has the story of Caesar burning the library become so famous? Part of the answer is that it makes for a better story. A single dramatic fire, a great villain, centuries of knowledge destroyed in one night. These elements create a compelling narrative. The truth that the library declined slowly over centuries through multiple smaller catastrophes and gradual neglect is less dramatic but more accurate. It's also worth noting that later writers had various motivations for emphasizing or inventing tales of library destruction. Some wanted to blame pagans for destroying knowledge. Others wanted to blame Christians or Arabs or various political figures. The Library of Alexandria became a kind of blank canvas onto which later cultures projected their own concerns and conflicts. What we can say with reasonable confidence is this: Caesar's fire caused real damage, probably destroying a significant quantity of scrolls, but it did not destroy the library. The institution survived, scholars continued their work, and the collection, though wounded, endured. The library would face worse trials in the centuries to come. But first, let me tell you about an extraordinary gift that may have replaced everything Caesar's fire destroyed and more. After Caesar's departure and eventual assassination, Cleopatra found herself aligned with another powerful Roman. His name was Mark Antony, and according to one famous story, he gave Cleopatra an extraordinary gift: 200,000 scrolls from the Library of Pergamon. Now, Pergamon was Alexandria's great rival in the book collecting world. Located in what is now Turkey, it had built a massive library of its own, reportedly second only to Alexandria's collection. The two cities had competed for centuries, each trying to outdo the other in accumulating scrolls. When Alexandria monopolized papyrus exports to prevent Pergamon from making more books, Pergamon invented parchment as an alternative. The rivalry was intense and legendary. So if Antony truly stripped Pergamon's library and shipped its contents to Alexandria, it would have been both a monumental act of devotion and a crushing blow to a rival institution. It would also have replaced any losses from Caesar's fire several times over. 200,000 scrolls would have made Alexandria's collection larger than ever. But here's where we need to be careful, historians. This story comes from Plutarch, writing about a century after the events supposedly occurred. He attributes the information to a single source, and that source may have had reasons to exaggerate or fabricate. Some modern scholars accept the story as basically accurate. Others view it with considerable skepticism. The truth, as so often with ancient history, lies somewhere in uncertainty. What we can say is that Alexandria remained the preeminent center of learning in the Mediterranean world throughout the Roman period. If the library had been catastrophically damaged by Caesar's fire, we would expect to see evidence of that decline in the historical record. Instead, we see scholars continuing to work in Alexandria, continuing to produce important research, continuing to reference the vast collections housed there. The Roman emperors who followed took various attitudes toward Alexandria and its intellectual community. Augustus, who defeated Antony and Cleopatra, incorporated Egypt into the Roman Empire but preserved Alexandria's cultural institutions. Later, emperors sometimes supported the scholars and sometimes persecuted them, depending on political circumstances and personal temperament. The library adapted to Roman rule as it had adapted to so much else. For 300 years under Ptolemaic kings, it had served Egyptian rulers. Now it served Roman ones. The essential mission remained the same: collect knowledge, preserve knowledge, expand knowledge. The nationality of the patron mattered less than the continuation of the work, and the work continued. Scholars in Roman Alexandria made significant contributions to astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and other fields. The great astronomer Ptolemy, not to be confused with the Ptolemaic kings, wrote his astronomical masterwork, the the Almagest in Alexandria during the 2nd century CE. This book would remain the authoritative text on astronomy for nearly 1,500 years. The intellectual tradition that began with the first Ptolemy's vision was still producing important work centuries later. But even as the library flourished under Roman rule, forces were gathering that would pose a new kind of challenge. Not fire this time, but something more profound. A transformation in how people understood the world, in what they believed, in what knowledge they valued. The rise of Christianity would reshape the Mediterranean world, and it would force institutions like the library to confront an uncomfortable question. What happens when the old wisdom conflicts with the new faith? For centuries, the intellectual life of Alexandria had been rooted in what we might call pagan philosophy. Not pagan in any negative sense, but simply the traditional religious and philosophical frameworks that had existed before Christianity. The scholars in the Mausion studied gods and goddesses, natural philosophy and mathematics, medicine and astronomy, all within a worldview that assumed the existence of multiple divine beings and the validity of ancient Greek learning. But the world was changing. A new religion, born in the distant province of Judea, was spreading rapidly through the Roman Empire. Christianity offered something different: a single God, a promise of salvation, a moral framework that spoke powerfully to people's hopes and fears. By the 4th century CE, Christianity had transformed from a persecuted minority faith into the official religion of the Roman Empire. This transformation had enormous implications for institutions like the library. The philosophical traditions it preserved were associated with paganism. The temples where scholars had gathered were temples to gods that Christians considered false. The great works of ancient literature included stories of Zeus and Apollo, heroes who consulted oracles and made sacrifices to idols. How should a Christian empire relate to this heritage? Different Christians answered this question differently. Some saw all pagan learning as dangerous, leading souls away from the true faith. Others believed that Greek philosophy contained valuable insights compatible with Christian teaching. Some advocated destroying temples and burning books. Others worked to preserve ancient knowledge while interpreting it through a Christian lens. Alexandria became a flashpoint in these debates. The city had a large Jewish population, and tensions between Jews and pagans had occasionally erupted into violence. Now, Christian communities added another element to this volatile mixture. Religious processions sometimes turned into riots. Theological disputes spilled into the streets. The Mausion itself seems to have continued functioning, though perhaps with reduced support and prestige. Scholars still worked in Alexandria, still accessed the library's collections, still produced significant intellectual work, but they did so in an increasingly uncertain environment. The political and religious landscape was shifting beneath their feet. One flashpoint was the Serapeum, a massive temple complex dedicated to the god Serapis. This temple housed what scholars call the Daughter Library, a secondary collection connected to the main library of Alexandria. Some sources suggest that scrolls from the main collection had been moved to the Serapeum over the centuries, making it another crucial repository of ancient knowledge. The Serapeum was more than a library. It was a functioning pagan temple with priests who performed rituals, worshippers who sought the god's favor, and a massive statue of Serapis that attracted pilgrims from across the Mediterranean. For Christians who viewed the old gods as demons or delusions, the Serapeum represented everything wrong with the ancient world. In 391 CE, the Emperor Theodosius issued a decree. Pagan temples throughout the empire were to be closed. Their treasuries were to be confiscated. Their rituals were to cease. What happened next in Alexandria would become one of the most contested events in the library's long history. A confrontation was coming. Violence was coming, and when the dust settled, the Serapeum would be destroyed. The question that still haunts historians is this: when the temple fell, were its shelves still filled with books? Let me tell you what we know. In 391 CE, following Theodosius's decree against pagan worship, the Christian patriarch of Alexandria was a man named Theophilus. He was ambitious, aggressive, and determined to transform Alexandria into a thoroughly Christian city. When he received imperial permission to convert an abandoned temple into a church, the conflict with paganism entered a new phase. During the conversion, Christians discovered ritual objects they considered scandalous. They paraded these items through the streets, mocking pagan beliefs. Pagans were outraged. Violence erupted. A group of pagans, including philosophers and intellectuals, barricaded themselves inside the Serapeum, taking Christian hostages. The standoff lasted for some time. Imperial authorities eventually intervened, ordering that the hostage takers be pardoned, but that the Serapeum be destroyed. Theophilus led a Christian mob to the temple. The great statue of Serapis, which had stood for centuries, was broken apart. The temple buildings were torn down. Some accounts describe pagans weeping as they watched, convinced that destroying the god's image would bring cosmic catastrophe. When the sky didn't fall, some saw it as proof that the old gods had no power. Now here's the crucial question: what happened to the books? Ancient sources disagree. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing around this time, described the Serapeum as housing libraries of immense value, second only to the original Mausion collection. His description uses the past tense, suggesting the books were already gone before the temple's destruction. But his grammar is ambiguous, and scholars interpret it differently. Other sources focus on the physical destruction of the temple, but say nothing about books at all. If hundreds of thousands of scrolls had been burned in 391, you would expect at least some writers to mention it. The silence is puzzling. One possibility is that the book collection had already been dispersed. Perhaps scrolls were moved to other locations as tensions rose. Perhaps the daughter library had declined over the preceding centuries and no longer held significant materials. Perhaps the most valuable texts had been copied and distributed throughout the empire, making their survival less dependent on a single building. Another possibility is that some destruction of books did occur, but later writers had reasons to minimize it. Christian chroniclers might not have wanted to emphasize the loss of pagan knowledge. Pagan writers might have focused on other aspects of the tragedy. The truth was inconvenient for everyone, so it was quietly forgotten. What we can say with confidence is that the Serapeum's destruction marked a turning point. Whatever books remained there were either destroyed, dispersed, or lost in the chaos. The physical center of pagan learning in Alexandria had been eliminated. The scholars who had gathered there were scattered. But here's something important to remember. The destruction of the Serapeum was not the end of learning in Alexandria. Christian scholars continued to work in the city. The intellectual tradition continued, though transformed. And some of the greatest minds associated with Alexandria would live and work in the decades after the Serapeum fell. One of those minds belonged to a woman, a philosopher, mathematician, and astronomer who became one of the most famous figures in Alexandrian history. Her name was Hypatia, and her story has become inseparable from the library's legend, even though the connection is more complicated than most people realize. Let me tell you about her. Hypatia was born around 360 CE, the daughter of Theon, the last known member of the Mausion. Her father was a distinguished mathematician and astronomer who edited and commented on classical texts. He educated Hypatia in mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy, and by all accounts, she surpassed him. She became a renowned teacher in her own right, attracting students from across the Mediterranean to study with her in Alexandria. What made Hypatia remarkable wasn't just her intelligence, though that was formidable. It was her independence. She never married, which was highly unusual for a woman of her era. She wore the distinctive cloak of a philosopher, moving freely through the city, lecturing publicly, advising political leaders. She was respected by pagans and Christians alike, and her students included people of various faiths. Her philosophical approach drew on Neoplatonism, a tradition that emphasized the existence of a single divine reality underlying all appearances. This framework was actually quite compatible with certain Christian ideas, and many of Hypatia's students were Christians who saw no conflict between her teachings and their faith. She represented the possibility of intellectual harmony across religious boundaries, but Alexandria, in the early 5th century, was not a harmonious place. The city was riven by conflicts between Christians, Jews, and pagans, and increasingly between different Christian factions. The patriarch Cyril, who succeeded his uncle Theophilus, was aggressive in asserting church authority. He clashed with the Roman prefect Orestes, who happened to be one of Hypatia's students and admirers. In 415 CE, the conflict between Cyril and Orestes reached a crisis point. Rumors spread that Hypatia was preventing reconciliation between the two men, using her influence to harden Orestes against the patriarch. A mob of Christian zealots, possibly connected to Cyril, though historians debate his direct involvement, attacked Hypatia's carriage as she traveled through the city. What happened next was horrifying. The mob dragged Hypatia to a church, stripped her, and murdered her with pieces of broken pottery. They then burned her body. One of the ancient world's most brilliant minds was extinguished in an act of savage violence. Hypatia's death has become symbolic of the library's destruction, even though the connection requires careful examination. She was not a librarian. The Mausion, if it still existed in any form, was already a shadow of its former self by her lifetime. She taught philosophy not in the library's halls, but in her own home and in public spaces. And yet, the symbolism persists, because Hypatia represented something the library also represented: the value of learning for its own sake, the pursuit of knowledge across cultural and religious boundaries. The idea that understanding the world is a worthy goal, regardless of its practical applications. When Hypatia died, something died with her, not the library itself, which had already declined over centuries, but perhaps the spirit that had animated the library at its height, the confidence that knowledge was worth preserving, worth pursuing, worth protecting at any cost. Hypatia was not the last scholar. Learning continued in Alexandria and elsewhere, but she remains a powerful symbol of what can be lost when religious and political conflicts turn violent. Her story haunts us precisely because we recognize how easily it could happen again. Now, let me address one more famous destruction story, the one involving the Arab conquest. In 642 CE, Arab forces under the general Amr ibn al-As conquered Alexandria. Egypt, which had been Roman and then Byzantine for nearly 700 years, became part of the expanding Islamic Caliphate. This conquest gave rise to one of the most famous stories about the library's destruction. And I need to tell you up front, this story is almost certainly not true. The account goes like this. After conquering the city, Amr wrote to the Caliph Omar asking what to do with the books in the library. Omar supposedly replied with devastating logic. If the books agree with the Quran, they are unnecessary, since we already have the Quran. If they disagree with the Quran, they are dangerous and should be destroyed. Therefore, burn them all. According to the story, the scrolls were used to heat the city's bathhouses, and so numerous were they that they kept the furnaces burning for 6 months. It's a vivid story. It's a quotable story. It has been repeated countless times. And it's almost certainly fictional. Here's why historians are skeptical. The story first appears in writing nearly 600 years after the events it describes. in accounts by writers who had clear motivations to portray the Arab conquest negatively. No contemporary sources mention anything about books being burned. Arab historians from the centuries immediately following the conquest, who wrote detailed accounts of the conquest of Alexandria, say nothing about a library or its destruction. The logic attributed to Caliph Omar is also suspicious. The early Islamic Caliphate was actually quite interested in preserving and translating Greek knowledge. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, founded in the 8th century, made systematic efforts to translate Greek philosophical and scientific works into Arabic. If Omar had established a precedent of burning Greek books, this later intellectual flowering would be difficult to explain. Furthermore, by 642 CE, the Library of Alexandria, as a functioning institution, had almost certainly ceased to exist. The Mouseion had been declining for centuries. The Serapeum was destroyed in 391. Whatever remained of the collections had probably been dispersed, destroyed, or decayed long before the Arabs arrived. So, where did the story come from? Historians have various theories. Some suggest it was invented by Christian writers seeking to blame Muslims for the loss of classical knowledge. Others think it may have originated as a cautionary tale within the Islamic world, warning against excessive literalism in interpreting scripture. The story's first documented appearance is in a work by a Christian writer who may have had political reasons to cast the Arab conquest in a negative light. None of this means the Arab conquest was without cultural disruption. Any major political transition causes losses. Institutions collapse, priorities shift. Knowledge that served the old order may seem irrelevant to the new one. But the specific story of Omar ordering the library burned lacks credible historical support. This matters because the myth about the Arab destruction has sometimes been used to promote hostility between cultures. It suggests a fundamental opposition between Islam and classical learning that the historical record doesn't support. In fact, Islamic scholars played a crucial role in preserving Greek knowledge and transmitting it back to Europe centuries later. So, if Caesar didn't destroy the library and Theophilus didn't destroy it, and Omar didn't destroy it, what actually happened? The answer is both simpler and more tragic than any of these dramatic stories. The Library of Alexandria did not die in flames. It died slowly, quietly, over centuries of gradual decline. And in some ways, this truth is more tragic than any dramatic destruction story, because it suggests that what happened was not inevitable. It could have been prevented. If enough people had cared enough, the library might have survived. Think about what a library actually needs to survive. It needs funding to pay for staff, for maintenance, for acquiring new materials. It needs skilled people who can read, copy, and preserve ancient texts. It needs political stability so that wars and riots don't damage the collections. It needs a culture that values what the library represents, that sees preserving knowledge as important. Over the centuries, Alexandria lost all of these things, bit by bit. Funding declined as Egypt's wealth was drained by foreign rulers. The Ptolemaic kings had been extravagant patrons of learning. The Roman Achaemenid emperors were less interested. Some supported the scholars, others ignored them. Still others actively persecuted intellectual communities they viewed as troublesome. The reliable stream of royal patronage that had sustained the Mouseion for generations dried up. Skilled scholars left for other cities. Rome became an attractive destination. Constantinople, the new eastern capital of the empire, drew intellectuals seeking imperial favor. When Hypatia was murdered, other scholars surely noticed what could happen to prominent thinkers who became entangled in political conflicts. Some must have decided that Alexandria was no longer safe. Wars and riots damaged the collections repeatedly. Caesar's fire, whatever its actual extent, destroyed some scrolls. The conflicts surrounding the Serapeum's destruction caused further losses. Economic disruptions interrupted the trade in papyrus that the library depended on. Each crisis took its toll, not catastrophic destruction, but steady erosion, and the cultural values shifted. Christianity placed less emphasis on the ancient pagan texts that formed the core of the collection. Preserving the works of Aristotle and Plato might still seem valuable, but what about the religious texts? The poetry praising gods no one worshipped anymore, the philosophy teaching doctrines the church considered heretical, the motivation to preserve everything weakened. The scrolls themselves were fragile. Papyrus deteriorates in humid conditions. It can be damaged by insects, mold, fire, flood. Without active effort to copy and preserve texts, they simply decay and disappear. When the scholars left and the funding dried up, no one was left to do this essential work. Books that had survived for centuries crumbled into dust. This is how the library really died, not with a bang, but with a whimper. Not in one catastrophic fire, but through countless small failures. Not because an enemy destroyed it, but because the people who should have protected it stopped caring enough. There's a lesson here that extends far beyond ancient Alexandria. Libraries, museums, universities, all the institutions we build to preserve and transmit knowledge, they require constant effort. They require people who believe the work matters. They require resources. They require protection. When any of these things fail, knowledge can be lost. The Library of Alexandria had been the greatest repository of human knowledge ever assembled, and it slipped away scroll by scroll over centuries until one day people realized that the dream Ptolemy had built was finally gone, but not everything was lost. Let me tell you what survived. Here's something that might comfort you as you rest tonight. The Library of Alexandria was never the only copy of most works it held. Throughout its history, scholars copied texts and carried them to other cities. Students who studied in Alexandria returned home with scrolls. The aggressive acquisition program that built the collection also meant copies existed elsewhere. When the library finally faded, it was not the sole repository of human knowledge. Many of the most important Greek works survived because copies existed in Constantinople, in Rome, in private collections scattered across the Mediterranean. When political conditions in one place became dangerous, scholars fled to other locations, carrying books with them. The knowledge was dispersed, which paradoxically helped it survive. No single catastrophe could destroy everything. But the most remarkable chapter in this story of survival involves a civilization that hadn't even fully emerged when the library was at its height. Beginning in the 8th century CE, Islamic scholars embarked on an extraordinary project of translation and preservation. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, founded by the Abbasid caliphs, systematically collected Greek philosophical and scientific works and translated them into Arabic. Think about what this means. Works by Aristotle, Plato, Euclid, Ptolemy, Galen, and countless others crossed linguistic and cultural boundaries because Islamic scholars recognized their value. These weren't Muslims translating the Quran, they were translating pagan philosophy because they believed truth was worth preserving regardless of its source. A famous saying attributed to the philosopher Al-Kindi captures this attitude. Truth, he said, is valuable wherever it comes from, even if it comes from races distant and nations different from us. For several centuries, the most important centers of learning in the world were in the Islamic Caliphate, Baghdad, Cordoba, Cairo. These cities preserved and expanded upon the Greek heritage during a period when Western Europe had largely lost access to it. Arab mathematicians developed algebra, Arab astronomers refined the models of Ptolemy, Arab physicians built on the works of Hippocrates and Galen. Then, beginning around the 12th century, this knowledge began flowing back to Europe. Scholars traveled to Spain and Sicily, regions where Christian and Islamic cultures interacted. They translated Arabic texts into Latin. They discovered works they hadn't known existed. They encountered mathematical and scientific concepts far more advanced than anything Western Europe had developed. This transmission of knowledge helped spark what we now call the Renaissance. When European thinkers rediscovered Aristotle, they weren't reading manuscripts that had been preserved in European monasteries. They were reading translations from Arabic, themselves translations from Greek originals that had once sat on the shelves of Alexandria and its successor institutions. The journey of knowledge from ancient Alexandria to medieval Baghdad to Renaissance Europe is one of the most remarkable stories in human history. It shows that ideas can survive the destruction of any single institution if enough people believe they're worth preserving. It shows that knowledge crosses boundaries of language, religion, and culture when minds are open enough to receive it. Tonight, when you consider how much was lost when the Library of Alexandria declined, remember also how much survived. Remember the scholars who copied and carried and translated and taught. Remember that the ideas generated in Alexandria's golden age still shape our world today. But we should also remember what we lost, because the losses were real and profound. Let me tell you about the silence. When historians study the ancient world, they are constantly aware of gaps, absences, questions that cannot be answered because the evidence no longer exists. Many of those gaps were once filled by scrolls that sat on the shelves of Alexandria. Consider the Greek tragedies. We possess complete plays from only 3 playwrights, and even from those 3, we have only a fraction of their work. Sophocles wrote more than 100 plays. We have 7. Aeschylus wrote perhaps 90 plays. We have 7. Euripides wrote around 90 plays. We have 18 or 19, depending on how you count. The rest existed. They were performed. They were read and studied. And they're gone. We know some titles. We have fragments quoted by other authors. We have ancient commentaries that discuss plots and characters. But the plays themselves, the actual words that audiences heard 2,500 years ago, have vanished. Every few years, archaeologists discover a papyrus fragment with a few lines of previously unknown text, and scholars around the world grow excited. A few more sentences recovered from the silence, but we'll never have the complete works again. The same pattern repeats everywhere. The philosopher Epicurus founded an influential school and wrote extensively. We have 3 letters and some fragments. The rest is lost. The historian Livy wrote 142 books covering the history of Rome. We have 35. The mathematician Apollonius wrote 8 books on conic sections. We have the first 4 in Greek, the next 3 only in Arabic translation, and the 8th is lost entirely. And these are the famous authors, the ones whose names survived even when their works didn't. How many writers have been completely forgotten? How many scientific observations, philosophical insights, historical accounts, poems, plays, and technical manuals vanished without leaving even a name behind? The losses extend beyond literature. Ancient scientists made observations and developed theories that might have advanced human knowledge by centuries if they had survived. Aristarchus proposed that the Earth orbited the Sun, but his detailed arguments were lost. How much faster might astronomy have progressed if his work had been available to later scholars? We'll never know. Ancient engineers built remarkable structures, aqueducts and roads and harbors, using techniques that weren't rediscovered for centuries. Some of that technical knowledge was surely written down. Some of those manuals must have existed in Alexandria. They're gone now. Medical knowledge suffered similar losses. Ancient physicians performed surgeries and developed treatments that later generations had to rediscover from scratch. The detailed observations of Herophilos and his successors might have transformed medicine if they had survived intact. There's something almost unbearable about contemplating these losses, not just because of what was lost, but because of what it represents. Centuries of human effort, observation, creativity, and thought simply erased. Not by malice, usually, but by neglect, by circumstance, by the simple fragility of papyrus and the indifference of time. When you read an ancient text that has survived, you're reading a survivor. It made it through. It was copied enough times, preserved in enough places, valued enough by enough people that it reached us. What we lost might have been equally brilliant. We'll never know. This silence in history, these gaps where knowledge used to be, perhaps that's why the Library of Alexandria haunts us so deeply. The Library of Alexandria has never really left us. 2,000 years after its founding, we're still talking about it, still mourning it, still trying in various ways to rebuild it. There's something about this particular story that speaks to something deep in human nature. The dream of gathering all knowledge in one place, of making wisdom accessible to anyone who seeks it, that dream didn't die with the library. It keeps coming back. In 2002, the Egyptian government opened a new library in Alexandria, explicitly designed to honor the ancient tradition. The Bibliotheca Alexandrina is a stunning modern building rising like a tilted disc toward the Mediterranean sky. Its walls are inscribed with letters from every writing system in human history. Inside, it houses millions of books, advanced research facilities, and museums dedicated to preserving cultural heritage. It's a beautiful gesture, a declaration that the dream of Alexandria still matters. But of course, no physical building can truly replace what was lost. The value of the ancient library wasn't just the scrolls it contained, it was the community of scholars, the culture of inquiry, the royal patronage that sustained it all. Those conditions can't simply be reconstructed, and yet we keep trying. Every great research library, every major university, every ambitious project to preserve and share knowledge, they all carry something of Alexandria's spirit. The Library of Congress in Washington, the British Library in London, the great university libraries at Oxford and Cambridge and Harvard, each represents an attempt to gather important knowledge and make it accessible. The internet represents perhaps our most ambitious attempt yet to build a new Library of Alexandria. Here is a technology that could theoretically make all human knowledge accessible to anyone with a connection. Digital texts don't deteriorate like papyrus. They can be copied instantly and shared worldwide. The dream of universal access to universal knowledge seems closer than ever, but the internet also reveals the challenges the ancient Alexandrians faced, now in new forms. How do you organize vast quantities of information so people can find what they need? How do you ensure quality and accuracy when anyone can contribute? How do you preserve digital content for future generations when technologies change so rapidly? The problems Callimachus faced when creating his Pinakes are recognizable to anyone building a modern search engine, and the internet is vulnerable in ways we're only beginning to understand. Websites disappear, platforms shut down, digital formats become obsolete. The assumption that once something is online, it's preserved forever has proven dangerously naive. We may be losing digital content at rates that would horrify the ancient librarians. Perhaps the most important lesson of Alexandria is simply this: knowledge requires protection. It requires people who care about its preservation. It requires resources and institutions and cultural values that prioritize the long term over the immediate. None of this happens automatically. All of it can be lost. The scholars who worked in Alexandria didn't know they were living in a golden age that would eventually end. They probably assumed the library would continue forever, that future generations would inherit and expand their work. They were wrong, and we would be wrong to assume our own institutions are immune to similar decline. The Library of Alexandria was destroyed, but the dream it represented keeps being reborn. Perhaps that's the truest form of survival, and so we come to the end of our journey tonight. We've traveled back 2,000 years, walked through marble corridors lined with scrolls, met brilliant minds who measured the earth and proposed that it orbited the sun, witnessed fires and riots in slow decline, and contemplated both what was lost and what survived. The Library of Alexandria was real. It existed. For centuries, it represented humanity's highest aspirations for knowledge and learning. The greatest minds of the ancient world gathered there, supported by kings who believed that collecting wisdom was worth any expense. They built something unprecedented, and for a while it flourished. Then, gradually, it faded. Not through one dramatic catastrophe, but through many small failures. Funding declined, scholars left, scrolls crumbled, and eventually the dream that Ptolemy had built was gone. But here's what I want you to carry with you as you drift toward sleep tonight. The library's destruction was not the end of the story. Knowledge survived because people believed it was worth saving. Scholars copied texts and carried them across continents. Translators in Baghdad and Cordoba preserved what Western Europe had forgotten. And centuries later, that knowledge helped spark a new flowering of human achievement. The ideas born in Alexandria are still with us. Every time you use geometry, you're connecting to Euclid. Every time you wonder about the size of our planet, you're asking questions Eratosthenes answered. The library's physical walls crumbled, but the knowledge it preserved became part of humanity's shared inheritance. Tonight, you remembered the Library of Alexandria, you thought about its scholars, its scrolls, its slow decline, and in that remembering, you participated in exactly what the ancient librarians hoped to achieve. You kept the ideas alive by thinking about them. That is how knowledge survives, not just in books and buildings, but in minds that care enough to remember. Rest well, my friend. The library is gone, but its spirit lives on in everyone who believes that knowledge matters. Sleep peacefully now,